it was impossible to understand why there was so much public anguish.
As the response kicked in, I remember very quickly feeling disgust for all the people who were going to Kensington Palace with toys and with presents and with gifts and weeping. I wouldn't be so hard now. I was much, much younger then. And I like to think I would be more compassionate. But at the time, I just remember you're projecting all this love onto somebody you didn't know.
There were people who felt, after, a decade of her being on the front, middle and all other pages of all newspapers and magazines, that they did know her and that they were intimately connected with her life.
I was looking at your bouquets there. Would you read what you've said on the card?
What I've said on the card? It's not just what you've done for us that makes us love you so, it's all the joy of who you are, the friend we've come to know.
Say?
I remember a phone-in where a man literally said that he was so upset, he'd never cried so much, his wife had died from cancer, but he'd never been this upset. And I think that was the moment I thought, you just have got to stop this. This is absolutely mad.
Police were now predicting that 2 million people would descend on central London for Diana's funeral, making it the biggest in British history. And with just 4 days to go, the planning meetings were becoming fraught.
The most tension in the room at those meetings always came from the Charles Spencer people. When I say tensions, it was sort of a slightly raised voice type of tension, or, a stiffening of the body.
Every detail of the funeral had to be agreed upon by both the Spencers and the royal family. But they couldn't see eye to eye.
There was more bitterness in the Spencer side and confusion and a sense that they didn't really know what to think or feel, because Diana was a very problematic issue in their own family.
Towards the end of her life, Diana's relationship with her brother Charles had broken down. To escape media attention, Diana had asked to live in a cottage on the family estate at Althorpe, but he had refused.
He felt the press would just decamp from London and move up to Althorpe, and he didn't want the press interfering with the smooth running of Althorpe. So they fell out, and they weren't speaking at the time of her death.
This made the tragedy of Diana's death even harder for the Spencers to bear. Earl Spencer wanted to make sure that, after death, Diana would again be part of the family.
It was almost like the tug of war, she's ours, she's ours. Spencer saying, you've thrown her out. You took away her HRH, and now you want her back? She's ours. So there was a lot of animosity.
Charles Spencer wanted to walk behind Diana's coffin in the funeral procession. But royal advisors weren't happy.
The royal family did not want the focus to be solely on Charles Spencer walking behind the coffin. They thought that wouldn't be right, that somehow it would set the Spencers apart from the royal family.
Although Charles had divorced Diana, he was adamant that he too should walk behind the coffin. And the funeral team wanted to go one step further. They believed that William and Harry, aged just 15 and 12, should join their father in the procession.
Diana was their mother, and William is one day going to be king, and therefore he needed to be seen to be taking a role in mourning the loss of his mother, and Harry by default, as the spare, should be seen as well, and it was a lot to ask of them.
But Prince William was refusing to take part.
He just didn't want to be seen grieving in public. He felt it was a private event. He was mourning his beloved mummy, and he didn't like the media attention. He probably felt that the media had had a hand in his mother's death. He didn't want to perform.
The funeral team set up a telephone conference with Balmoral to try to persuade the reluctant prince.
I can remember, sort of sends a tingle up my back actually, even thinking about it, is we were talking about this, and then from the box this huge big wooden box in the table, the voice of Balmoral, came Prince Philip's voice. And we hadn't really heard it before, I don't think. And it was anguished. You know, he was saying, you know, these are the boys here. You know, you're talking about these boys, you know, who've lost their mother. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment. And you did think, you know, that sort of brought it back to me, my God, you know. There's a bit of suffering going on up there.
The Queen and Prince Philip were doing everything they could to protect the young princes. But this wouldn't satisfy a nation in mourning. Soon, a growing public anger would focus on the royal family, plunging them into their biggest crisis since the abdication. Three days after Princess Diana's death, the carpet of flowers at Kensington Palace now stretched more than 50 feet. And queues for the books of condolence were 11 hours long. But as the flower mountains got bigger and the queues grew longer, the mood in the crowd had shifted.
That's the thing I most recall, actually, is the speed in which it turned from those sort of tears and this trauma to anger, you know, against the royal family.
Bunkered down in Balmoral, the royal family had not appeared or said a word in 3 days.
I think it's disgraceful that they're not here in residence.
She hasn't said anything, the Queen.
Oh, yeah.
And as for Prince Charles, well, I think there's not a lot he can say, really, is there?
Prince Charles had been unfaithful to Diana during their marriage, and following their divorce, she had been abandoned by the royal family.
I think they treated her terrible. Absolutely shocking. I don't think they're the most cold people on this earth.
The crowd began to focus their anger on one conspicuous issue. Above every major building in London, there was a Union Jack flying at half-mast. But at Buckingham Palace, the flagpole was bare.
I think it must be very, very cold-hearted not to have a flag up. I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
Throughout history, the Union Jack had never been flown over the palace. Royal protocol dictated that the only flag flown was the royal standard, and that was only when the Queen was in residence.
It's actually an in and out sign. It goes up when the Queen's there and it comes down when she's away. But this became a symbol of royal callousness.
42,000 people rang the Sun newspaper, demanding that the royal family do away with protocol and fly the Union Jack at half-mast over the palace. But the Queen was sticking resolutely to tradition. No flag would fly.
On hindsight, yes, we should have been more forceful. The Lord Chamberlain should have been more forceful, Private Secretary should have been more forceful, or somebody should have just done it.
I really am upset. I can't understand the Queen doing it, really.
No. Everything people like about the Queen, which is she is careful and she is cautious and she is not emotional and she is not impulsive. She is steadfast. That's what she is. Everything they always liked about her, they realised that week they didn't like so much that particular week because they wanted to run down to London and give everybody a cuddle.
Faced with a rising tide of public anger, courtiers in London were now seriously concerned that the Queen was losing touch with her people.
There were battles going on, there's no doubt about it. Messages were being relayed to try and encourage the Queen to engage more. They wanted the Queen to come down to London as soon as possible. But the Queen and her immediate family were still resistant to that.
Unlike the Queen, Tony Blair was an expert judge of public mood. He intervened to try to persuade her to act.
Tony was talking to the Queen and just saying, look, you know, things are getting a little bit hot down here.
Blair later claimed that he asked the Queen to show her vulnerable side. But Her Majesty wasn't budging.
It's not stubbornness, It's just that she's been around a lot longer than everybody else that's working for her. And she's not going to be pushed by an agenda, by a media agenda that, well, you know, somebody famous has died, so it's got to happen now.
The Queen was adamant that her rightful place was at Balmoral with her grieving grandchildren. Since Diana's death, the family had rallied round the young princes. Every day, Prince Philip would take them walking, fishing, and horse riding, anything to take their minds off the tragedy.
What the royal family pulled around was the fact that here were two young boys who had lost their mum. And I don't think there's a human being alive who doesn't respond to that as being an important thing to do.
It was actually the first time in her whole long reign that the Queen was thinking of family before she was thinking of her people. And for that we should really admire her, because her whole attention and thoughts were for these children. She wasn't thinking about how this was going to, quote, be played on the media.
The following morning, the press took aim at the Queen. Earlier in the week, the newspapers were being blamed for Diana's death. Now, they attacked the royal family.
In this case, I think it was a conflation of public desire and the press being very quick to get the attention away from themselves and onto someone else. It's the first time I'd felt, ooh, I wonder if this is what a civil war feels like. I wonder if this is how it is before it kicks off.
In the face of such sustained criticism, Prince Charles was now deeply concerned. As he had predicted, the royal family were now being directly blamed for Diana's death. He still believed it was his duty to walk in the funeral procession behind Diana's coffin, but he was increasingly worried for his own safety.
Prince of Wales was convinced that he was going to be the focus of the anger, that he was the real target of the anger. I mean, he thought that he might have been attacked, actually physically attacked.
In response, the Metropolitan Police drafted in a team of mounted officers to guard the funeral procession.
One of the protection officers said there's just one area where we can't cover the angle that Prince Charles will be walking at, and they asked me if I could move slightly to my right in Parliament Square so that I was covering Prince Charles. And I remember, of course, at the time I went, yeah, that's fine, no problem. But I remember thinking afterwards, so what you're asking me to do is, if somebody wanted to try and assassinate Prince Charles, they'd have to shoot me first. So, you know, at the time you just go, yeah, that's fine. But you do think about it afterwards, thinking, what did I just agree to?
Charles was anxious not only for his own safety, but for the future of the monarchy. He was now convinced that the Queen had to act, so he joined forces with the Prime Minister.
Tony Blair spoke to Prince Charles and implored Charles to talk to his mother to try and sort of break the logjam.
Under extreme pressure from the media, her people, her government, and her own son, the Queen responded.
It finally became clear to her, out of self-preservation, for which, you know, she's known, that this was something bigger and more important than her own personal feelings.
Firstly, she asked her press officer to break with protocol and appear on television to defend the royal family.
The Queen has asked me to say that the royal family have been hurt by suggestions that they are indifferent to the country's sorrow at the tragic death of the Princess of Wales. Prince William and Prince Harry themselves want to be with their father and their grandparents at this time in the quiet haven of Balmoral. As their grandmother, the Queen is helping the princes to come to terms with their loss as they prepare themselves for the public ordeal of mourning their mother with the nation on Saturday.
Following the statement, the palace announced a series of astonishing steps. For the first time in history, the Union Jack would fly at half-mast over the palace. The royal family would return to London on Friday, a day earlier than planned, to meet the grieving public. And most remarkably, the Queen would address the nation on television. It would be her first live broadcast in 50 years. This was a truly unprecedented climb down by an institution that had always resisted change.
It was very hard for the Queen to do what she had to do, yielding, if you like, to public pressure. She knew better than anyone that if she lost, or the royal family lost, the affection of the public, then their days really were numbered.
To gauge the public reaction, Princes Andrew and Edward were asked to walk amongst the crowds on the Mall, the first royal public appearance in 4 days.
No one knew which way it would go. There was real anger. The moment they were seen, this sort of relief started to go. People just wanted to talk to these princes about their former sister-in-law.
That evening, the Queen, Philip, Charles, William and Harry stepped outside the Balmoral gates for the first time since Sunday to look at the tributes that had been laid to Diana. Finally, the world saw them as they were, a family united in grief. Faced with the biggest crisis in half a century, the Queen and the royal family had fought back. But tensions were still running high. In less than 24 hours, the Queen would return to London to face the vast crowds, and she had little idea how they would react.
Good afternoon. We're breaking into your regular ITV schedules to bring you a special programme on the return of the royal family to London for the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales.
5 days after Diana's death, the royal family had finally bowed to intense public pressure to share openly in the nation's grief.
It was a grim-faced Prince of Wales who drove his 2 sons out of the grounds to begin the journey to London. The Queen, with Princess Margaret, left a short time afterwards. They were driven by the Duke of Edinburgh, a family together, mourning a family loss.
Princes Charles, William and Harry boarded the royal plane at Aberdeen Airport. Normally it is forbidden for 2 future kings to fly on the same plane. But the boys were desperate to be with their father, and the Queen gave them special permission. With less than 24 hours to go until Diana's funeral, organisers were working round the clock to make sure London was prepared. Two million people were now expected to line the streets for the funeral. To accommodate the vast crowds, funeral organisers had quadrupled the length of the procession route. It would now stretch from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, 4.5 miles through central London, twice the length of Churchill's funeral procession.
The police were horrified by this because they just didn't think they'd have the manpower to block off all the roads and ensure public safety, if you like.
In response, the Metropolitan Police mounted the biggest security operation ever seen in Britain. 35,000 officers were needed on the streets for the funeral, so all police leave was cancelled and extra manpower called in from surrounding forces.
It was one of those military exercises where you keep having to change the map board because the amount of territory is needed to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And more territory, more police, more security implications, more whatever is required.
Huge screens were set up in Hyde Park and Regent's Park, with room for 100,000 people.
It was an incredible organisational feat. The logistics and the security. I mean, there were so many things to work out.
Meanwhile, last-minute rehearsals were taking place at Westminster Abbey. Diana's royal coffin was lined with lead and weighed 50 stone. To get used to the weight, her pallbearers had to practice with a dummy version.
We got told we're going to try and simulate the weight with a curbstone. And we thought, God blimey. So I'm not sure if it was 1 or 2 curbstones, but it was heavy. So we managed to get the coffin on our shoulders and start walking around. And this was the first time we actually got a feel for the cathedral floor. It's marble, and it was like an ice skating rink because you wear metal studs. And we went up and down, up and down, up and down, getting the feel of the actual marble itself. Did put a bit of a reality check. If something did happen, it's going to happen there.
Three hours after leaving Balmoral, Charles, William and Harry arrived in central London. The young princes hadn't yet had a chance to experience the staggering response to their mother's death. So at their request, they made a detour to Kensington Palace to look at the hundreds of thousands of tributes that had been left for her.
So juxtaposed with this behind palace gates approach that we had seen earlier in the week with no visibility of the royals at all. And suddenly here they are, like in plain sight for everyone to see at this moment of untold grief and upset.
William!
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was a very moving occasion. Both boys behaved with fantastic dignity. They were, by turns, interested and sad and humbled, I think, by what they saw. And also they kept it together, because what everyone prayed for, above all, was that the occasion didn't overwhelm them and they didn't break down, and they didn't.
Your mom was a wonderful woman. She was a great leader. God bless
They all said thank you very much for coming. William said thank you so much for the flowers, and I know them thank you ever so much.
And I shook his hand, and then I got all tearful. I couldn't say anything.
2 miles across London, the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh were heading for Buckingham Palace. They had little idea how they would be received by the vast crowds.
So much bitterness had been written in newspapers. So there was a certain amount of apprehension from the Queen as to how she would be greeted.
There, for the first time, the Queen witnessing for herself.
I think the car is going to stop. The car has stopped, and Her Majesty is going to get out. She is going to look for herself at some of the thousands upon thousands of floral tributes.
The Queen and Prince Philip left their car to a muted response.
The attitude of the crowd was unpleasant, and it was something which I have never ever seen before in any royal occasion, ever. You know, usually when the Queen goes by, people clap, people cheer, people wave. They don't just stand there.
I was waving my flowers, and she came over and asked me if she wanted me to go and put them down with all the rest of the flowers. And I said, no, they're for you, Mum. They've been drummed into me to call her Mum. Mustn't forget to call her Mum. She'd held my hand at this point. She was shaking, and she sort of questioned me, like, are you sure? And I was like, I think you deserve them. I think you've done the right thing staying with your grandsons. I think I actually said, you know, if my mum had just died, I'd want my grandma with me.
I actually think that perhaps what Kate said struck home and people realised that perhaps they'd been totally unfair to someone who, after all, has given her life to our country.
Don't cry.
I'm not going to cry, but you know that's what I believe.
Mum, take care of the boys. Take care of the boys. Sorry?
That's what we've been doing.
Courtiers had had little idea how the crowds would react. Now they, and the Queen, could breathe a sigh of relief.
When the Queen was leaving the enclosure to go back into the palace, she walked towards me and she had a look on her face as if to say, you know, was that okay? And I just nodded.
Three hours later, every television channel interrupted their normal broadcasting and cut to Buckingham Palace. The Queen was about to deliver her first live address in half a century.
Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope. So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I hope that tomorrow we can all, wherever we are, join in expressing our grief at Diana's loss and gratitude for her all too short life.
I thought it was amazing because it was delivered faultlessly and with some degree of, I felt, empathy. She wasn't a remote figure. She genuinely was saying what she felt.
I'm sure she found it excruciatingly difficult to give that address. I thought that really showed the Queen as somebody who did listen and was willing to adapt and change her behaviour.
I thought she said everything she should have said. Can't think of anything that she left out at all.
She sounded very sincere and she looked as though she was very moved, and I think that will satisfy everyone.
The Queen had bowed to public pressure as never before, and she had helped heal the rift between crown and country. Later that evening, Diana was taken home to Kensington Palace, where she would spend one last night.
Behind a coffin shrouded in the royal standard and adorned by a spray of her favourite white lilies, drove her two sons, Princes William and Harry, bringing their mother back home.
It was quite an extraordinary occasion, actually. There was a lot of people crying, but it was also quite uplifting too, in many ways, because you felt, yeah, this woman really did reach out.
The boys said a final, private farewell to their mother, before Paul Burrell, Diana's butler for over a decade, kept a solitary all-night vigil over her body.
I asked the policeman to bring in flowers from outside, and I decorated the room and lit all the candles, and I pulled a chair up and I sat with her. It may sound silly now, 20 years later, but I just wanted to have a last conversation and tell her about all the people that had been ringing and all the people that had left messages and all the people that had expressed their love for her. I thought that was important.
That night, Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, paid her own personal tribute to her daughter.
Diana's mother told me that she had found the whole experience of the mourning extremely moving. It really did touch her, and she told me that she spent hours walking the streets among the people who had come to mourn her daughter.
With the funeral now just 12 hours away, 30,000 people bedded down on the streets, with a further 500 on a specially adapted train in Paddington Station. After 6 days of intense public grief, London was ready for the biggest funeral in British history. The morning of Princess Diana's funeral. The culmination of one of the most remarkable weeks in modern British history. The events of the past few days had shaken the monarchy and the nation to its core. Now the funeral would be a chance for both to grieve together. The service was to take place at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests had been invited, and many started queuing from the early morning.
I remember rushing out into the garden and picking roses and wrapping them in cooking foil and taking them with me. Not the most elegant bouquet you ever saw, but I just wanted some sort of tribute, and arrived at Westminster Abbey and just put them there.
Across Britain, 33 million people tuned in to watch, with a further 2.5 billion around the world. The biggest global audience in television history.
That's Whitehall, cenotaph at the end. People just waiting silently.
In London, more than 1 million people had now crowded onto the procession route, with tens of thousands in Hyde Park and Regent's Park. As a sign of respect, the police had imposed a no-fly zone across London, giving the city a sense of calm. Then, with the time drawing close, a deeper hush descended.
The silence. I mean, you really could hear a bee buzzing. There were no planes overhead.